The day Lillian Lawson traded her last living horse for a seat on a westbound wagon was the same day she decided she had nothing left to lose, and that particular kind of freedom, she would later learn, was the most dangerous thing a woman could carry into the frontier. It was the spring of 1872, and the Missouri River town of Independence was swollen with the desperate and the dreaming. Lillian stood at the edge of the staging ground with her boots cracked at the soles, and her dress so thin from washing that the morning light passed right through the cotton like it passed through gauze. She was 26 years old, and she had survived a drought that killed her father's crops, a fever that took her mother the following winter, and a marriage proposal from a man in Baxter County who smelled like turpentine and had the eyes of something cornered. She had survived all of it by sheer, furious will, but she had not survived with any money, and she had not survived with any of the land her father once called his own, because the bank in Springfield had taken that the autumn before she packed her single carpet bag and rode the chestnut mare named Pearl all the way to Independence. Pearl was a good horse. Pearl was the last gift her father had ever given her, a warm-breathed, wide-shouldered mare with one white sock and a habit of pressing her nose into Lillian's hair when she was sad. Selling Pearl felt like cutting off her own hand. But the wagon master at the staging ground, a barrel-chested man named Elias Crumb, who wore his authority like a badly fitting coat, had looked at Lillian's empty coin purse and her empty hands, and told her plainly that passage west to the Oregon Territory ran $35 a head, and that sympathy was a luxury only stationary people could afford. Lillian had stood in the mud of the staging ground for a very long time after that conversation. She had watched other families load their crates and their children and their hope into the covered wagons, and she had felt something in her chest go very still and very cold. Then she had walked Pearl to the horse trader on the south end of the lot, a gap-toothed man who looked at the mare and looked at Lillian and offered her $30 without blinking. She had asked for $35. He had said $32. She had taken it. She did not look back at Pearl as she walked to the wagon master's table with the coins counted out in her palm. She could not have, and kept walking all the same. So that was how Lillian Lawson came to be seated on the rough wooden bench of a covered wagon heading west, with no horse, no money, and a carpet bag that held one spare dress, her mother's Bible, a tin cup, and a folded letter from a woman named Clara Hennessy in the Oregon Territory who had written to say that there was work in her household and a room in the back of the house, if Lillian could make it out. Clara Hennessy was a distant cousin, twice removed, and Lillian had met her exactly once at a family gathering when Lillian was 9 years old. She had no certainty that the letter was even still good, that the offer still stood, that Clara still lived in the same place, or that Clara was even still alive. But the letter was what she had, and so she held it in her lap and watched Missouri fall away behind her and told herself that hope was not the same thing as foolishness, even when it looked almost exactly like it. The wagon train moved in the lurching, miserable way of all wagon trains, which is to say slowly and with constant small disasters. A wheel cracked on the third day, and the whole company halted for half an afternoon in the sun, while the men argued about how to fix it. A child in another wagon ran a fever that terrified her mother for a week before breaking clean. The trail went muddy after a night of rain, and 2 wagons got their axles sunk to the hubs, and everyone had to put their shoulders to the task of hauling them free. Lillian pulled with the rest, not because anyone expected her to, but because standing idle while others worked was not something she knew how to do. She ate sparingly, more sparingly than even the rations allowed, because she had arrived at the wagon train with nothing and the wagon master's arrangement only covered transport, not food, and she depended on the small kindnesses of the other travelers. A woman named Mrs. Abernathy, who was traveling with her husband and 4 sons to take up a homestead claim, pressed hard biscuits and dried beef into Lillian's hands without making her feel the weight of the charity, which was the most gracious thing anyone had done for her in a very long time. Lillian repaid it by helping with the woman's children, keeping the younger two occupied and out of trouble, which was itself no small task when the trail was long, and the wagon wheels were loud, and small boys were small boys. It was at the relay station, at the edge of the Kansas territory, that everything changed. The relay station was a low, wide-shouldered building built from sod and rough timber, sitting at the junction of two trails like a thumb pressed into the earth. It served as a waypoint for wagon trains, a post station for the mail riders, a trading post of modest ambitions, and according to the smell of it, also apparently a stable. There was a long hitching rail out front and a water trough and a flag that had seen better decades. And behind the main building, there were two smaller structures and a corral with 6 horses moving lazily in the morning heat. The wagon master announced they would stop here for a day and a half to rest the animals, take on supplies, and allow anyone with urgent correspondence to post it. People climbed down from the wagons with the grateful, stiff-legged movements of people who had been sitting on wooden boards for 2 weeks, and the yard in front of the station filled with the sound of voices and children, and the creak of supplies being unloaded. Lillian climbed down and stood in the sun with her carpet bag and looked at the station. She needed food. Not the charity biscuit kind, but real food, enough to carry her through the next leg of the journey, and she needed it badly enough that her hands had started to tremble slightly in the mornings, which she recognized as a sign she could not ignore. She had spent every coin she'd had on the wagon passage. She had nothing to trade except the labor of her hands, which she was prepared to offer freely if anyone at the station needed it. She went inside. The interior of the relay station was one long, dim room smelling of tobacco and harness leather, and the particular dusty warmth of any building that has been full of human beings for a long time. There was a counter along one wall, shelves behind it stacked with goods, a pot-bellied stove in the center of the room, and several rough tables and chairs occupied by a handful of men. At the far end of the counter, bent over what appeared to be a large ledger book with the focused attention of a man who had learned to concentrate despite considerable noise, was the station agent. Lillian registered him the way you register any figure in a room you have just entered, as a shape, a presence, a piece of the landscape. Tall, she noted, dark hair that needed cutting, shirt rolled to the elbows. Then she walked to the counter and waited. He did not look up immediately, which she did not take as rudeness because he was clearly in the middle of something that required counting, and interrupting someone's count was its own kind of rudeness. She waited. After a moment he made a notation in the ledger, set down his pencil and looked up. His eyes were the color of creek water in summer, that particular shade of gray-green that is not quite either but entirely its own thing, and they were direct without being hard, which was not as common a combination as people like to think. "Good morning," he said. His voice was calm and level, the voice of a man who spent his days managing the small crises of a way station and had learned which emergencies were real and which were simply loud. "What can I do for you?" "I am looking for work," Lillian said. "Temporary. I am traveling with the Crumb Party headed west and we are stopped here a day and a half. I can cook, I can clean, I can mend, I can keep accounts if you need it. I am not asking for wages in coin. I am asking for food. Whatever you think is fair in exchange for whatever work you need done." She said it plainly because plain was the only way she knew how to say things that mattered, and because she was tired of the particular performance some people expected from women asking for help, the softening and the apologizing and the making herself small. She was hungry and she was capable, and those two facts seemed sufficient. The man behind the counter looked at her for a moment. Not the assessing, uncomfortable look that some men gave women they were deciding how to take advantage of, but something more like the look of a person who had just heard something clearly and was considering it honestly. "Can you keep accounts?" he said. My father ran a farm and I did his books from the time I was 14, she said. I can do sums in my head faster than most people can do them on paper. Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile but the precursor to one. The name's Robert Holloway, he said. I run this station. My bookkeeper left for California 3 weeks ago and I've been doing it myself, which is to say I've been doing it wrong. He held out his hand. She shook it. His grip was firm and brief and treated her hand like a hand rather than a thing to be barely touched. Lillian Lawson, she said. Miss Lawson, he said. I have a ledger that has not been properly balanced in 3 weeks, a supply inventory that may or may not be accurate, and a shipment coming in tomorrow morning that needs to be logged against what we ordered 6 weeks ago. I also have a cook who is going to be laid up for at least another week with a sprained wrist, which means I have been boiling things and calling it meals, which my men have been tolerating with heroic patience. He paused. I can offer you 3 meals a day, a full food pack for the road when you leave, and whatever else seems fair once I see the books. It was more than she had hoped for. She kept her face steady so as not to show how much more. That sounds fair, she said. Good, said Robert Holloway, and reached under the counter and produced the ledger, which was indeed in a state that suggested 3 weeks of mathematical good intentions and insufficient execution. He set it on the counter between them. I'll show you where we keep things and you can start wherever you like. Lillian set down her carpetbag and opened the ledger. She had thought, walking in, that she would spend a day and a half doing work and eating meals, and then climb back on the wagon, and that would be the end of it. She had not thought much beyond that, because the frontier had taught her quickly that thinking too far ahead was a way of accumulating disappointments, and she had enough of those already. But a day and a half turned out to be a long time when you were in a place that had things in it worth paying attention to. The first thing she noticed, once she began working through the ledger, was that Robert Holloway was not actually bad at mathematics. He was bad at organization. The numbers were nearly always right. They were simply in the wrong columns, or recorded in the wrong order, or entered without sufficient context to make sense of them 3 weeks later. It was the kind of bookkeeping done by someone who understood the work but had been taught no method for recording it, and once she understood the pattern of his errors, she could see exactly how to untangle them. She worked at the counter while the station moved around her. Men came in and bought things and Robert handled the selling, and occasionally he would glance over at what she was doing, and she would explain a correction she had made, and he would nod with a kind of focused attention that said he was actually listening, not just waiting for her to finish speaking. Around noon, he set a plate of food in front of her without asking, because she was in the middle of something and stopping to ask would have interrupted the work. It was simple food, beans and cornbread, and a slice of salt pork, and she ate it without stopping what she was doing, which she thought might have made her look uncivilized but which she could not help, because the food was exactly what she needed and her body knew it and was not waiting on manners. You were not lying about the accounts, Robert said at one point, leaning over the counter to look at the page she was on. I rarely lie, Lillian said. It's too much work to keep track of. He laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that comes out before a person has decided whether to let it, and it surprised him slightly, which she could see in the quick expression that crossed his face after. He had a good face, she thought. Not the handsome of paintings or dime novels, but the handsome of a person who spent time in weather and thought about things, and had not let either make him mean. She looked back at the ledger before he noticed she had been looking at him. By the time the afternoon had gone gold and the shadows stretched long across the yard, she had the ledger balanced, and the inventory reconciled with a single page of notes explaining each correction and the reasoning behind it. She set her pencil down and rolled her shoulders and looked at what she had done with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has taken a thing that was wrong and made it right. Robert Holloway came to look at the finished work with the expression of a man who had been braced for more difficulty and found less. He was quiet for a moment, going through the pages she had corrected. "This is thorough," he said. You had the information, she said. It was just filed badly. Where did you learn this? He asked. Not disbelieving, just curious. My father, she said, and then necessity. She paused. He had a farm in Missouri. When the drought came, he needed to know exactly where every cent was going so we could know exactly how long we could last. Accurate accounts are the difference between knowing you have time to find a solution and thinking you have time when you don't. Robert was quiet for a moment after she said that. Your father's farm, he said carefully. Is he still there? He died, she said, 2 winters ago. She said it with the flatness that comes not from not caring, but from having said it enough times that the words had worn smooth. My mother the same winter. The bank took the farm the following autumn. He did not say he was sorry, which she was grateful for, because sorry was a word that people said when they did not know what else to say, and it never helped. What he said was, "And so you're heading west." "And so I'm heading west," she agreed. There was a pause that was not uncomfortable, which was notable because pauses between strangers were usually one or the other. Where? He asked. Oregon Territory. I have a letter from a cousin, or a distant cousin, Clara Hennessy. She has a place near the Willamette Valley. He nodded slowly. That's a long way still. I know, she said. Lillian cooked supper that evening for the station crew, which consisted of Robert, 2 young men named Billy and Cass who handled the horses and the heavy work, and an older man named Frank who managed the mail and seemed to regard conversation as a personal affront. She made a proper stew with the vegetables from the station's small kitchen garden and the dried beef from the stores, and biscuits from the proper method, and she set it on the table and watched the 4 men eat with the particular attention of people encountering something they had been missing. Ma'am, said Billy, who was perhaps 19 and had the earnest quality of a golden retriever, this is the finest thing I have eaten in 3 weeks. That is not a very high bar, Lillian said, but she said it kindly. Frank said nothing, but he went back for a second helping, which Lillian took as the highest possible compliment. Robert ate his supper without making a performance of how good it was, but he ate all of it and then sat with his coffee and looked at the middle distance with the expression of a person who has been fed after being hungry for a while. Then he looked at Lillian, who was eating her own portion at the end of the table. You mentioned you left Missouri with no money, he said. He said it directly, not gently, which she preferred. Is that still the case? Yes, she said. The food pack we agreed on will carry you through to the next station, but it's going to be a lean stretch after that. He wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. I want to offer you something else. My regular bookkeeper is not coming back, as far as I can tell, because the last letter I received from him suggested he had found work in San Francisco and had no intention of returning to Kansas. If you wanted to stay on here for a month, do the accounts and help in the kitchen, I could pay you proper wages. Enough to make the rest of your journey without worrying about how you're going to eat. Lillian looked at him across the table. She thought about Clara's letter, which was 8 months old now. She thought about Oregon, which was still very far away. She thought about Pearl, her last horse, and what it had cost to come this far, and what it might cost to finish the journey without any margin at all. She also thought, though she tried not to place too much weight on it, that she was sitting at a table that felt more like a place she belonged than anywhere she had been in 2 years, and that the man who ran the relay station had looked at her empty hands and offered her work rather than pity, and had laughed at her honest joke, and had not once in the course of the day made her feel like a burden or a problem or a temporary inconvenience to be managed. 1 month, she said. 1 month, he agreed. She wrote to Clara Hennessy that night. By the light of a candle in the small room Robert cleared out for her use, explaining the delay and promising she would still come when she was able. She did not know if the letter would reach Clara before she herself did, given the state of mail service in 1872, but she sent it anyway because it was the right thing to do. Then she lay on the narrow cot in the small room and listened to the night sounds of the Kansas prairie, the wind through the grass, the distant call of something she thought might be a coyote, the creak of the station settling in the night, and she felt, for the first time in a very long time, like she was in the right place. She did not examine that feeling too carefully, not yet. The supply shipment came in the next morning as promised. A wagon loaded with flour, salt, dried beans, coffee, lamp oil, and a miscellany of hardware goods, along with 2 crates that turned out to contain books, which Robert had apparently ordered from a supplier in St. Louis. Lillian helped log the inventory against the original order and found 3 discrepancies, 2 in the station's favor and 1 not, which she noted carefully in the ledger and brought to Robert's attention. 3 crates of salt instead of 4, she said, showing him the relevant line. He looked at it and then looked at the delivery man, who had the particular expression of someone who hoped no one would check. Robert settled that matter with a controlled firmness that did not require raising his voice, which Lillian respected. The missing crate of salt appeared from the back of the supply wagon within 10 minutes. The wagon train departed that afternoon. Lillian stood in the yard and watched it go, the line of covered wagons moving west along the trail with their particular lurching dignity, and she felt a pull that was part wistfulness and part something else, some recognition that she was choosing to stay put when she had been in motion for so long that stopping felt strange. Mrs. Abernathy, leaving with her husband and 4 boys, pressed Lillian's hands and said she hoped the territory would be good to her, and Lillian thanked her and meant it, and watched until the last wagon crested the low rise and disappeared. Then she turned around and went back to work. The rhythm of the relay station was not so different from the rhythm of a farm, she found. There were things that needed doing at regular intervals, things that needed doing as they came up, and things that needed doing whether you wanted to do them or not. Lillian fell into it with the ease of someone who had spent their whole life in that kind of rhythm, and by the end of the first week she knew where most things were kept, had reorganized the kitchen to a logic that made more sense, and had established a bookkeeping system that would be easy for anyone to follow even if she were not there. She also, without entirely meaning to, began to know Robert Holloway. He was 31 years old, she learned, born in Kentucky to a family that had come through the war on the losing side, which had cost them most of what they had. He had come west in 1868 and worked for the Overland Mail Company before the relay station post came open, and he had applied for it and gotten it, because he was organized, capable, and had a reputation for being straight in his dealings. He had been running the station for 3 years now. He lived in the back 2 rooms of the building, slept in one and kept the other as a kind of combination sitting room and office, and the sitting room had 3 shelves of books, which explained the order from St. Louis. She found out about the books because she needed something to read in the evenings, her mother's Bible being the only thing she had brought in that line, and she had read it sufficiently in times of grief that it was more of a comfort than a story now. She asked Robert if she could borrow something from his shelves, and he told her to take whatever she liked, and when she came back the next evening with a question about one of the books she had chosen, he answered it, and that turned into a conversation that lasted 2 hours and covered a great deal of territory unrelated to the book itself. He had opinions and was not afraid to state them, but he listened when she disagreed, which she did several times, because she also had opinions and had never seen the point of hiding them. He read her silences correctly, which was rarer than it should have been. He did not talk over her. When she said something that surprised him, his face showed it honestly rather than performing a careful neutrality, and she liked that. She also noticed, in the way that you notice something you are trying not to put too much weight on, that he was aware of where she was in a room. Not in a way that was uncomfortable or watchful, but in the way that you are aware of a fire when it is cold, an orientation toward warmth that is not the same thing as staring at it. The second week brought a party of 4 men heading south toward Texas, rough-edged and trail-worn, who stopped at the station for supplies and the night. 3 of them were ordinary enough. The fourth had the kind of eyes that made Lillian step slightly back from the counter, and he looked at her with an assessment she recognized and did not like. She handled it the way she always handled it, which was to be precise and businesslike, and to give him nothing to work with. Robert was in the yard when the man came to the counter the second time in the late afternoon and asked Lillian what time she finished her work. She was in the middle of telling him plainly that it was not a relevant question when Robert came through the door and registered the situation in about 3 seconds, the way a man who has run a way station for years learns to read rooms. "Everything all right?" He asked, and he directed it at Lillian, not at the man, which told her that he understood who needed to be asked. "Fine," she said. "I was just finishing up here." The man looked at Robert and then looked at Lillian and then made a calculation and turned and went back outside. Robert watched him go, then looked at Lillian. "Has he been trouble?" he said quietly. "Not quite trouble," she said. "Just the sort of unpleasant that stops short of it." Robert nodded. "Frank will be in the main room tonight," he said, "and I'll be up." "I can manage," she said, because she could. "I know you can," he said. "I'll still be up." The 4 men left in the morning, and the station returned to its ordinary rhythms. And Lillian thought about the way he had said that, the simple certainty of it, and the way he had asked her first before assuming. And she thought that paying attention to these things might be becoming something she could not stop. It was on a Thursday evening in her 3rd week that it rained. A proper Kansas prairie rain that came in from the west like a moving wall and hit the station with a force that made the tin roof sound like an orchestra. Lillian had been in the kitchen when it started and had run out to help Billy and Cass get the horses under cover, and by the time the animals were settled, she was soaked to the skin and shaking with cold even though it was May, because the rain had come in on a cold wind and the prairie did not apologize for the contradiction. Robert met her at the door with a dry blanket, which he held out without making a fuss of it. She took it and wrapped it around herself and stood in the doorway watching the rain come down in silver sheets across the yard. "Thank you," she said. "There's coffee on," he said. They sat at the table nearest the stove because the stove was still warm from supper and drank coffee and listened to the rain, and it was the kind of comfortable quiet that 2 people only achieve when they have already said enough to know they do not need to fill the silence. "Do you like it here?" he asked eventually. "The station, the work?" She considered it genuinely rather than answering reflexively. "Yes," she said, "more than I expected to." "What did you expect?" "Something to endure," she said honestly. "A way to earn what I needed. I didn't expect to find it interesting." "And do you find it interesting?" "The accounts are interesting," she said. "Watching the trains come through is interesting. Every group of people tells you something about where they're coming from and where they think they're going." She paused. "The country itself is interesting. I didn't know it would be, but it is." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "And the company." She looked at him across the table. The lamplight was warm and the rain was loud, and the stove made a small, domestic tick. His face was open in a way it was not always open, the way faces are sometimes open in the rain, when the ordinary conditions that require people to hold themselves together have been temporarily replaced by something that makes pretense seem too much effort. "The company," she said carefully, "is the most interesting part." He held her gaze for a moment, and something moved in his expression that she felt in her own chest, a recognition like 2 notes of the same chord struck in different rooms. Then he looked down at his coffee, and she looked down at hers, and the rain continued, and neither of them said anything else for a long while, but the silence had changed character entirely. She did not sleep well that night, though the rain had softened to a steady drum that ought to have been soothing. She lay in her narrow cot and thought about Oregon and Clara's letter and Pearl, and all the miles between here and where she had been trying to go. She thought about what it meant to stop moving, and whether stopping was the same as giving up, and whether giving up was always the wrong thing, or whether it depended entirely on what you were giving up and what you were staying for. She got up before dawn and made coffee, and sat with it in the dark kitchen and read her mother's Bible, not for the comfort this time, but for the practice of it, The way her mother had always said that some books you read for what they say, and some you read to remind yourself how to be still. Robert found her there when he came in for his own coffee before sunup, and he looked at her sitting in the lamplight with the Bible and her coffee, and his expression was gentle in a way that was not soft, the kind of gentle that knows the difference between peace and sadness and can tell which one it is looking at. He poured his coffee and sat across from her without speaking, and they watched the dawn come through the kitchen window together, and that was, Lillian thought, one of the most intimate things that had happened to her in a very long time. The third week turned to the fourth. The trail brought new travelers. 2 homesteading families heading for Nebraska, a minister traveling alone with a mule, and a wooden case of Bibles that he was bringing to a mission settlement 3 days west, a cattle buyer returning east who told them business was good, and the ranches were running big herds down through Texas. Lillian checked them all in and took their payments and logged their purchases and watched their faces, reading in them the stories of where they had come from and what they were hoping for. And Robert worked alongside her, and they fell into a practiced efficiency that made the work feel less like 2 separate people doing adjacent tasks and more like 2 parts of the same mechanism. On the 28th day, Robert asked her to come outside at the end of the evening, when the work was done and Billy and Cass and Frank had all gone to their own quarters. He said it simply and without ceremony, and she went with the feeling of someone walking toward something they have been watching approach from a long way off. They stood in the yard under a sky full of stars that the Kansas prairie produced in spectacular quantity, the kind of sky that city people never saw and that you had to be very far from everything to fully comprehend. The night was warm and smelled of grass, and something faintly sweet that she thought might be wild onion. "Your month is nearly up," Robert said. "Yes," she said. 2 more days." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the stars with the thoughtful steadiness of a man organizing what he wants to say. "I've been thinking about what I want to say to you," he said, which was such a direct acknowledgement of what she had been watching him do that it surprised a small laugh out of her. "Have you?" she said. "I have." He turned to look at her. "I know you have a plan, a cousin in Oregon, a letter, a reason to keep going west. And I know that plan was made when you had nothing here, which was true. But I want to say something to you before you go, in case the fact of your leaving makes it harder to say." She waited. "I would like you to stay," he said. "Not because I need someone to do the accounts, though I do. Not because you are a good cook, though you are. But because in the past month you have been the most genuinely interesting person I have spent time with in 3 years of running this station, and I have been aware of where you are in a room since the second day you were here, and I think that the reason I look up when you walk in is not professional courtesy." He said it plainly, the same way she said things that mattered, without softening or performance, and it landed the same way plain things landed, directly and fully. "Robert," she said. "You don't have to answer the way I'm hoping," he said. "I know this is not a simple situation. You have plans. You had them before you had anything else. I'm not asking you to throw them away. I'm just saying that I would like the chance, if you would give it to me, to see where this goes, whatever this is." "I know what this is," she said. The words surprised her slightly as she said them, but they were true and she knew it. She had known it, honestly, since the evening of the rain, and perhaps before that since the morning of the dawn, and perhaps before that since a Thursday at a counter when he had laughed at her joke before he meant to and not tried to take it back. "So do I," he said quietly. She looked at the stars for a moment and then she looked at him. "I need you to understand something," she said. "I am not a woman who does things by halves. If I stay for a real reason. Not because I'm tired of moving or because this is easier than going on or because I'm afraid of the rest of the road. I stayed an extra month because the work was real and the pay was fair and because I needed it. If I stay past that, it will be because I want to and not because I don't have anywhere else to be." "I understand that," he said. "I would not want any other version of it." "Then I'll tell you something," she said. "I have thought about Oregon every day for the past month. I have thought about Clara's letter in the Willamette Valley, and the room in the back of the house. And every time I think about leaving here, the thing that makes it hardest to picture is not the road. It's leaving this place." She paused. "Leaving you." He was very still for a moment. Then he reached out and took her hand, carefully and without hurry, and she let him, and they stood in the yard under the Kansas stars, and it was exactly as enormous and exactly as simple as all real things are. She wrote another letter to Clara Hennessy. It was a harder letter to write than the first one, because it required more honesty and more explanation, and because Lillian was not certain, even as she wrote it, that she was making the right choice, only that it was the true one, which was the best she could do. She explained that she had found work at a relay station in Kansas, that she had met a person who had changed the nature of her plans, and that she hoped Clara would understand. She sent the letter, and then held her breath in the way you hold your breath when you have committed to something, and the air needs to change before you can think about it clearly. Clara wrote back 6 weeks later, which was remarkable speed for 1872, and the letter said simply, "Stay if he is worth staying for, and I will be here if he is not," which was, Lillian thought, the most generous and the most accurate thing anyone had said to her in the whole of the business. The summer came in full and blazing. The relay station was a busy place in summer, when the trail traffic was heaviest, and every week brought new parties through. Families and prospectors and cattle drivers, and the occasional dignitary who had overestimated the romance of the frontier and underestimated its discomfort. Lillian handled the accounts and the kitchen and, increasingly, the front counter as well, because she had a manner with people that put them at ease without compromising the station's business interests, which Robert recognized and valued explicitly rather than taking for granted. He was, she was discovering, a man who named things. When he noticed her doing something well, he said so. When she pointed out a problem he had not seen, he thanked her without defensiveness. When he was wrong about something, which happened with moderate frequency and in the ordinary way of people who are fallible and not embarrassed by it, he said so plainly and corrected course. These were not exceptional qualities in theory, but in practice, in her experience of how men actually behaved, they were remarkable enough that she found herself marking them deliberately, cataloging them against the part of her that had learned, after 26 years, to be skeptical of what men said versus what they did. They matched, in Robert's case. That was what she found. What he said and what he did were the same thing. He courted her with the same directness he brought to everything else, which is to say without fuss, and with considerable sincerity. He brought her wildflowers from the prairie once, and then looked mildly embarrassed about it, which was endearing enough that she put them in a tin cup on the counter. He suggested, when the evenings were long and the station was quiet, that they read aloud to each other from the books on his shelves, and they did, taking turns with chapters and disagreeing regularly about the characters' choices. And she found that reading with someone was a way of learning a great deal about them in a very pleasant manner. He rode out with her on a Sunday afternoon when Billy could mind the station, because she had said that she missed being on horseback, and he had 2 horses in the corral that needed the exercise, and the prairie in midsummer was a thing worth seeing from the back of a horse. She missed Pearl during that ride. She had told Robert about Pearl, and he had listened with the attentiveness he brought to things that mattered to her. And when they came back from the ride, he showed her a mare in the far end of the corral, a steady bay with a calm eye, who was not Pearl and was not meant to be Pearl but was a horse. And he said she was welcome to ride her whenever she liked. And Lillian put her face against the bay's neck for a moment and did not say anything, which he understood. He asked her, 6 weeks after the conversation under the stars, if she would stay on permanently. Not just for work, and not with the careful indirectness that some men would have used, but plainly. Would she stay, and would she give him the chance to see if what this was between them was what he thought it was? She said yes on both counts, which she said as simply as he had asked, and they shook hands like 2 people closing a proper deal, which made them both laugh. And the laughter broke something open that had been building carefully for weeks. And he kissed her then, still with the remnants of laughter on his mouth. And it was the most honest kiss she had ever experienced, which is to say it felt exactly like what it was. She moved her few possessions from the small back room into the one room that had been designated a sitting room, because the arrangement of the station made it sensible, and because they were conducting themselves properly, which Robert was clear about because he respected her, and also because he was a man with a reputation in the community of travelers who passed through, and that reputation mattered for practical reasons. Lillian respected the practicality and also found it, privately, not unromantic to be treated like a woman worth conducting oneself properly toward. There were complications, as there were always complications in real things. There was the question of who Lillian was, in the eyes of the travelers who came through. Some of them, the older, more conventional ones, had opinions about a woman living and working at a relay station with an unmarried man, and these opinions were expressed in the particular pointed manner of people who have decided their opinions are the same thing as standards. Lillian dealt with this by being so conspicuously competent and professional that the opinions had nowhere comfortable to land. Robert dealt with it by being direct in a way that closed conversations, and by not caring, which was not rudeness but genuine indifference to the assessment of people who had decided the form of a thing mattered more than the substance. There was also the question of what the future looked like. Lillian had not arrived at the relay station looking for a future. She had been looking for food and passage, and the future had happened to her anyway, as futures tended to. But she was a woman who liked to know the shape of things, and so she asked Robert, one evening in early autumn when the first cold came in and they were sitting by the stove with their respective books, what he intended for the station long term. He looked up from his book. "I intend to keep running it," he said. "It's good work and there's more of it coming. The territory is opening up. The rail line is coming west, and when it gets here the nature of the work will change, but the work will still be there." "And beyond the station," she said. He put down his book. He recognized she had noticed when a conversation was happening that required his full attention. "Are you asking me what I am hoping for?" he said. "I think I am," she said. "I am hoping," he said carefully, "for the same thing I think you are hoping for, which is something real, something that lasts. I'm not a man who does things by halves either, Lillian." She looked at him across the warm room. "Then we had better be sure," she said. "I have been sure," he said, "since about the third day." She thought about that for a moment. "The third day," she said. "You corrected the salt crate, and then explained the correction to me without making me feel foolish for not having caught it," he said. "I thought that was the most practical kind of kindness I had ever seen." She laughed, fully and without reservation, and the sound of it in the warm room was a thing she could have drawn a picture of if she had been able to draw, the exact shape of a moment when you realize you are happy. Robert Holloway asked Lillian Lawson to marry him on the 1st of October, 1872, which was a Saturday. He did not do it with a great ceremony or a prepared speech. He did it in the kitchen in the morning while she was making biscuits and he was drinking his first cup of coffee, because that was the kind of life they actually lived, and it seemed appropriate to do the asking in it rather than outside it. He said, "Lillian, will you marry me?" She had flour on her hands, and the biscuits needed another 2 minutes of working, and the sun was just coming through the kitchen window and laying a long stripe of gold across the floor. She looked at him across the kitchen. She thought about everything she had traded to get here. The farm in Missouri and her father's hard hands and her mother's voice reading aloud on winter evenings. Pearl, her good horse with the white sock and the warm nose. $32 and a wagon bench, and 3 weeks of lurching westward with strangers. She thought about the morning she had walked into a relay station with nothing but herself and the hunger and the willingness to offer her hands for honest work, and the man behind the counter who had looked at those empty hands and said, "What can I do for you?" "Yes," she said, "I will." He crossed the kitchen and kissed her properly, and then she went back to the biscuits because they needed finishing, and he refilled his coffee and leaned against the counter watching her, with an expression that she felt on her skin like warmth. And the morning went on in the ordinary beautiful way of mornings in which something important has just been settled. They were married in November by a traveling minister who came through on a Wednesday and stayed 2 nights. It was a simple ceremony, done in the main room of the station with Billy and Cass and Frank as witnesses, and the minister read from Scripture and asked them the proper questions, and they answered them in front of whatever God was paying attention that afternoon in Kansas. Lillian wore her better dress, which she had mended carefully and pressed with the iron she had borrowed from the supply stores, and Robert wore a clean shirt and had found time to have his hair properly cut, which she noticed and did not say anything about but which meant something to her. Afterward they had supper, and Billy made an earnest and slightly disorganized toast that said, essentially, that Lillian was the best thing that had happened to the station since the time they fixed the roof, which she took as the high compliment it was meant to be. Frank contributed nothing verbal but brought out a bottle of good whiskey from wherever he had been keeping it, which was more eloquent than most speeches. The winter was cold and close in the way that Kansas winters could be, the kind of cold that pressed against the walls of the building and made the stove into the most important object in the world. But the station had good walls and plenty of fuel, and Lillian had stocked the kitchen in the autumn with the forethought of someone who had lived through one bad winter already and was not interested in repeating the experience. They were comfortable in the cold, which was its own kind of luxury, and the months of snow and wind that kept the trail slow and quiet gave them time to inhabit the life they had made rather than simply managing it. She wrote to Clara Hennessy again, a long letter this time, telling her everything. Clara wrote back in the spring with such warmth and humor and complete lack of grudge that Lillian read the letter twice, and then folded it very carefully into her mother's Bible, where she kept the things she wanted to keep. Spring came back to the prairie like a promise that had been slightly delayed, the grass coming green in a slow wave across the flat land, the meadowlarks arriving and staking their territories with song, the trail traffic picking up again as the weather eased and the families loaded their wagons and set out for the west. Lillian stood at the station and watched them go, as she had watched that first wagon train go 9 months ago, but she watched it now from a different place, from a place that was hers, and the pull she felt was not wistfulness but something warmer, a recognition that she understood what it was to want a thing so badly you would trade everything you had for the chance at it, and that sometimes what you were trading toward was not at the end of the trail. It was in the late spring of 1873, when the wildflowers had come back to the prairie in their brief and extravagant show, that Lillian knew she was expecting a child. She knew it the way women know such things before the evidence is entirely conclusive, a bodily certainty that precedes proof, and she held the knowledge for a week before she said anything, not from fear or uncertainty, but from the private pleasure of knowing something important while it was still new. When she told Robert, they were in the yard at the end of an evening, in the place where they had stood under the stars 9 months before, and the grass was long and smelled of early summer. She told him directly and watched his face. His face did the thing faces did when they were surprised by joy, which is to say it ran slightly ahead of his composure and arrived somewhere unguarded and luminous before the rest of him caught up. "Lillian," he said. He said her name the way he sometimes said it, as if it were the end of a sentence rather than the beginning of one. "Yes," she said, "that's the situation." He laughed and pulled her into his arms, and she let herself be held there with her face against his shoulder and the grass moving quietly around them in the evening wind. And she thought that the thing about happiness was that it always arrived looking slightly different than you expected it to, because you could not have known in advance exactly what shape your particular happiness would take. The months that followed were full in the way that good years are full, not with drama, but with substance, the ordinary textures of a life being lived rather than survived. The station got busier through the summer as the trail traffic increased. There were rumors that the rail line was extending westward faster than anyone had predicted, which meant that the nature of the relay stations would shift. But Robert was paying attention and had already written to the company to discuss how the station's role would adapt. He was, Lillian had found, a man who read the direction things were going and thought ahead, which was the same quality she had in her own way with the accounts, and they made a good pair for it. She kept the accounts and helped with the trading and managed the kitchen, and increasingly served as a kind of informal mediator for the traveling families who came through with their disputes and their questions and their needs, because she understood both the desperation of being on the road with nothing and the practical requirements of getting through it, and people could tell she understood, which made them trust her. She also, as the summer deepened and her pregnancy became evident, found herself on the receiving end of considerable practical knowledge from the women who passed through, homesteaders and settlers who had survived their own journeys and their own winters and their own first children on the frontier, and who shared what they knew with a forthright generosity that she had come to recognize as the particular sisterhood of women in hard places. Their son was born in December of 1873, in the same building where they had first met and first shaken hands, and first understood what the other one was. And it was a long and exhausting labor that Robert handled with a steadiness that she was grateful for even when she was too occupied to say so. The midwife who attended was a capable German woman who lived 2 days' ride east and came in at Robert's urgent request, and she delivered the baby with the efficient calm of someone who had done this many times and was not alarmed by the difficulty of it. He was a healthy boy, dark-haired like his father and with Lillian's direct gaze, and they named him Thomas James Holloway, Thomas for the minister who had married them and James for Lillian's father. Robert held his son with the careful wonder of a man encountering something larger than anything he had previously experienced, and Lillian, exhausted and aching and more tired than she had ever been in her life, watched his face and thought that this, right here, this was the thing she would have told her younger self about if she could have, not the horse she would lose or the farm or the parents or the cold road west, but this, that trading everything you have for the chance to get somewhere better is not a failure. It is sometimes exactly the right thing. You just cannot always see at the moment of the trade what better is going to look like. The winter was a good one, as Kansas winters went. Thomas was a solid, curious baby who regarded the world with an interest that reminded Lillian of his father's way of looking at a ledger, as if everything had an underlying logic he was in the process of working out. Billy, who was by now 21 and had grown from an earnest boy into an earnest young man, was devoted to the baby, with an enthusiasm that Lillian found both touching and occasionally excessive. Frank had no verbal response to the arrival of Thomas Holloway, but he carved a small wooden horse and left it on the kitchen table one morning without explanation, which was the most expressive thing anyone had ever seen Frank do. The rail line came through in 1875, as predicted, and the nature of the relay station changed with it, as Robert had anticipated. The long wagon trains grew less frequent as more people came by train, but the station adapted, serving a different kind of traveler now, train passengers who needed a night's stay or supplies for the shorter overland portions of their journeys, a changing mix of people from a wider range of places, some of them speaking languages that Lillian had never heard and bringing with them the evidence of how vast and varied the world outside the frontier actually was. She found it endlessly interesting. She always had. By 1876, the station had grown to include a proper dining room for travelers, a small post office addition, and a second full-time employee hired to help Cass and Billy, who had both stayed on and were now fixtures of the place in the way that solid, reliable people became fixtures. The accounts that Lillian kept had grown more complex as the business grew, and she had taught herself double-entry bookkeeping from a manual Robert had ordered from St. Louis, and she handled the station's finances with a precision and clarity that would have been notable in any context, and was, in the context of a Kansas relay station in the 1870s, essentially extraordinary. She knew it was extraordinary. She was not self-effacing about it. She had worked too hard and sacrificed too much to be falsely modest about what she was good at. In the spring of 1876, Lillian was 30 years old and expecting her second child, and Thomas was 2.5 years old and had recently discovered that he could climb most of the furniture in the station, a discovery he was exploiting thoroughly. The station was busy and solvent and growing, and Robert had just accepted an additional contract with the Postal Service that would bring regular mail runs through the station on a weekly basis, which would require an expansion of the receiving area and some reorganization of the layout, which Lillian was already planning in her head. She was at the counter going over the expansion plans with Robert one afternoon when the door opened, and a woman came in who stopped just inside the threshold and looked around with the eyes of someone who has traveled a long way and is not sure they have arrived at the right place. The woman was perhaps 40, heavyset, with a weathered face and good eyes and a dress that had been good once and had been repaired many times since. She held the hand of a girl of perhaps 6 who had dark braids and looked at everything in the room with a child's complete attention. Lillian knew the posture. She knew it in her bones. She came around the counter without making it conspicuous. "Can I help you?" she said. "I'm looking for passage," the woman said. "West, I don't have money." She said it the same way Lillian had said it 4 years ago, with the flatness of someone who has already had to say it more than once and knows what it usually means. Lillian looked at her for a moment. Then she looked at Robert, who had come around the counter as well and was looking at the woman with recognition in his face, because he too knew that posture now, had learned it from the woman standing beside him who had worn it herself once. "Why don't you sit down," Lillian said to the woman, "and tell me where you're trying to go?" The woman's name was Alice Patton, and she was going to her sister in the Colorado Territory, and she had a daughter and a carpetbag and the particular fierce, tired dignity of someone who has run out of options except the one right in front of them. Her husband had died of a fever the previous year. She had sold what she could and spent what she had getting this far, and she had come to the end of what the money could do. Lillian listened to all of it and then went to the kitchen and came back with food, setting it in front of Alice and the girl without ceremony. And when Alice started to say she could not pay for it, Lillian said, with the firm kindness of someone who knows what they're doing, "It's not for payment. Eat." They worked it out as the afternoon went on. Alice could cook well and had a strong back, and there was a westbound party leaving from the junction in 2 days that had room for one more if the passage could be arranged. Robert handled the arrangement with the wagon master himself, and the station's accounts absorbed the cost of Alice's passage in the category labeled miscellaneous good cents, which was a category Lillian had created in the first month of their marriage for exactly this kind of thing. Alice Patton and her daughter spent 2 nights at the station and then went west with the wagon party, and Alice shook Lillian's hand before she left with a grip that said everything she could not find words for, and Lillian squeezed back and said, "Your sister is going to be glad to see you," which was not something she could know, but which she said with conviction, because conviction was sometimes what a person needed more than certainty. Robert came to stand beside her as they watched the wagon party move off down the trail. "I suppose we do that now," he said, not as a question. "We have the means and the knowledge," Lillian said. "It seems wasteful not to." He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him slightly, and they stood in the yard of the relay station they had built together from a ledger and a plate of stew and a conversation about accounts, and watched the trail. Their daughter was born in the autumn of 1876, which made her a Kansas girl in the exact same way Thomas was a Kansas boy, which is to say shaped by wind and grass and wide sky, and the constant evidence that the world was both harder and more beautiful than you expected. They named her Eleanor Grace Holloway, Eleanor for Robert's mother and Grace, because it seemed like the right word for what they had been given. Thomas received his sister with the cautious, territorial interest of a 3-year-old encountering a rival, which gradually and with considerable negotiation on Lillian's part, resolved itself into a protective affection that was clear even before Eleanor was old enough to appreciate it. By the time Eleanor was a year old, Thomas had appointed himself her primary guardian, a role he took very seriously, and which Robert observed with the particular quiet delight of a man watching his children be people. The later years of the 1870s were years of settling and deepening, the kind of years that do not make for dramatic stories, but that are the foundation on which everything real is built. The station continued to grow and adapt. Lillian's reputation for fair and thorough accounts spread in the way that good reputations spread in small communities, by word of mouth and demonstrated reliability, and she occasionally helped other small businesses in the area with their books, not as a formal service, but as the kind of help you offer when you have something that someone else needs, and the giving of it costs you less than the receiving of it helps them. She wrote to Clara Hennessy every few months and received letters in return, long and vivid, and full of Oregon detail that made Lillian feel she had not lost that world entirely, merely relocated her stake in it. Clara came east on a train in 1878 to visit, a visit that had been planned for so long that by the time it happened Lillian half expected to feel like she was meeting a stranger. But Clara was warm and sharp, and immediately at home at the station, in a way that said the letter offering that distant room had been written by someone who genuinely understood the meaning of family. Robert and Clara had a wary, respectful acquaintance that resolved within 2 days into something easier, because Clara was direct about her opinions, and Robert handled direct opinions without defensiveness, and the two things together meant they could talk about things honestly, which was all either of them needed. Clara held Eleanor and looked at Robert across the table and said, in her frank way, she made the right choice staying. I know, Robert said. I'm aware of that daily. Good, Clara said. Men who are aware of being lucky tend to stay lucky. Lillian, from the kitchen doorway, heard all of this and said nothing and felt something settle in her chest like the last piece of something fitting into place. The station saw all kinds in those years. They saw the movement of people that was the story of the West, families and prospectors and dreamers and the disappointed and the pragmatic, people running toward things and people running away from things, and often enough both in the same party. They saw also the weight of what that movement cost, the communities displaced, the land taken in ways that did not bear comfortable examination, the people on the other side of the westward push who had been there before, and who paid the price of other people's frontier dreams. Lillian had seen it from the wagon trail, and she saw it from the station, and she did not look away from what she saw, because looking away was a kind of lie, and she had never had much patience for that variety. She talked to Robert about it with the same frankness she talked about everything, and he listened, and they were people who could sit with uncomfortable truths without needing to resolve them into something easier, which was perhaps the most grown-up thing they did together. The station had its difficulties, as all enterprises do. There was a year when the supply chain was badly disrupted, and they ran short of several things they needed, and had to improvise and negotiate, and make do in ways that required creativity and patience in roughly equal measure. There was a dispute with a contractor who tried to overcharge them, and who met in Lillian's bookkeeping a level of documentary precision that left him very little room to maneuver. And the dispute was resolved in the station's favor without requiring anything more than the production of accurate records, which Lillian found satisfying in the particular way that well-organized paperwork is satisfying. There was a winter that was harder than the others, cold enough that they were genuinely concerned about the horses and the supply of fuel, and Robert spent 3 days riding to arrange an emergency delivery that covered the gap. He came back half frozen, and Lillian put him by the stove and fed him the thickest soup she could make, and said nothing pointed about what the ride had cost him physically, because there was nothing to say except that he had done what needed doing and she was glad he was back. He looked at her from his chair by the stove, warming his hands on the soup bowl, and said, "I thought about you the whole ride." "Did it help?" she said. "Considerably," he said. Thomas started at the school in the nearest town at the age of 7, which required a ride of some distance that Robert organized with the family of another child going the same direction. And Thomas took to school with the same methodical interest he took to everything, approaching his lessons as a set of problems to be solved with sufficient attention. He had his father's steadiness and his mother's precision, a combination that his teacher, an earnest young woman named Miss Henderson, who had come out from Ohio with a strong sense of purpose, described in her reports as formidable. Eleanor was different, more intuitive and more social, quick to read people and quick to respond to them, the child who remembered everyone's name and what they had been talking about last time and where they had come from. She was, in other words, the kind of person who was made for a place where the whole world came through the door, and she had grown up in exactly the right one. By the time the 1880s arrived, the relay station had been transformed by the fully extended rail line into something somewhat different than it had been, less a stopping point for wagon trains, and more a proper way station serving train passengers and the remaining overland traffic, and the growing local community of ranchers and farmers and merchants who had built themselves into the landscape of that part of Kansas. Robert's postal contract had expanded to include a sorting function, and Lillian had taken on the bookkeeping for 2 other local businesses, which she did with a quiet professional gravity that made people sometimes forget she had arrived in the territory with nothing but a carpetbag and a willingness to work. She did not forget. She never forgot, because she thought that forgetting where you had come from was a way of losing the knowledge of what things actually cost, and she had paid enough for her knowledge to value it. Thomas, at 14, was old enough to help seriously with the station's operations, and he did so with a competence that made Lillian proud in the particular way that parents are proud when a child is not simply following instructions, but actually understanding the reasons behind them. He asked good questions and did not accept unsatisfying answers, which was a quality she recognized, and which she encouraged even when it meant the questions were pointed at her. Eleanor, at 12, had started keeping her own notebook of observations about the people who came through the station, not in a prying way, but in the way of someone who finds human beings genuinely interesting and wants to record them accurately. Lillian found the notebook once by accident and read several pages, and then put it back exactly where she had found it and said nothing, because what Eleanor was doing was a form of what Lillian had always done herself, paying attention, keeping accurate records, and that was not something you interrupted. There was a morning in 1882, when Lillian was 36 years old, and the Kansas spring was doing its annual extravagant thing with wildflowers and light, that she stood in the yard of the relay station and looked at what she could see of the life she had built. The station building, solid now after 10 years of maintenance and additions, sitting in its yard with the well and the corral and the garden. The horses in the corral, including a good bay mare that she rode when she could, not Pearl and not Ever Pearl, but a horse she had named her own in her own way. The sound of Thomas inside at the counter, handling a customer with a confidence that was his own. Eleanor's voice from the kitchen, talking to someone, laughing at something. Robert came up beside her from wherever he had been, from the stable or the post office addition, or one of the dozen daily tasks that constituted the running of the place, and stood next to her in the sun with the easy proximity of 2 people who have spent a decade in each other's gravitational field. "What are you thinking?" he said. "I'm thinking about Pearl," she said. He knew about Pearl, had known from the first weeks, the horse she had traded for the seat on the wagon that had brought her here. He was quiet for a moment. "Do you regret it?" he said, not defensively, just honestly asking. "Not the choice," she said. "Never the choice. I just think about her sometimes." She paused. "I think about what it cost to get here, and then I look at what here is, and I think that Pearl was a good horse who carried me as far as she could and then got me somewhere better." He took her hand the way he had that first night under the stars, with the same carefulness and without hurry. "We should get another horse," he said. "A proper one you choose yourself." She looked at him. "That is a very expensive idea." "We can afford it," he said, with the quiet certainty of a man who knows the books are in good hands. She squeezed his hand. "Yes," she said, "I suppose we can." In the summer of 1883, Lillian Lawson Holloway rode out onto the Kansas prairie on a chestnut mare she had chosen herself from the stock of a reputable breeder 60 miles east. A wide-shouldered, warm-breathed horse with one white sock who pressed her nose into Lillian's hair and stood very still when she cried, because horses know these things. She had named her Pearl. She had thought about whether that was too much, too sentimental, too much like trying to undo something that could not be undone. And then she had decided that sentiment was not the enemy of clear thinking, and that honoring what a thing had been was not the same as pretending it had not cost what it cost. She rode out into the summer grass, and the sky went on forever in every direction, and the wind moved the grass in long, rolling waves that looked from the back of a horse exactly like the surface of a sea she had never seen but somehow recognized. And she thought, "I traded everything I had for the chance at something better, and I got here, and here is this." Robert watched her from the yard, a hand raised against the morning sun, growing smaller as she rode out. She looked back at him once, and the distance between them at that moment was exactly right. Enough space to see him clearly, close enough that she was never out of sight of home. Thomas Holloway grew up to be a man who was as precise as his mother and as steady as his father, and who took over the management of the station's accounts at 18 with a thoroughness that made Lillian work less and read more, which she had been meaning to do for years. He was, in the manner of young men who have grown up watching their parents be genuinely and practically in love, absolutely clear about what he was looking for in his own life, which made him discerning in ways that occasionally frustrated him, but ultimately served him well. Eleanor Holloway grew up to be the person everyone in a room instinctively trusted, which is a rare quality and one that cannot be taught, only recognized and given room to develop. She took her notebooks full of observations and her natural facility with people, and eventually became a teacher herself. First at the school in the nearest town, and eventually at a school she helped establish closer to the station, because she believed, as Lillian had always believed, that knowledge was the most portable thing a person could carry. The relay station, through all of this, remained. It changed shape as the territory changed and the decades moved, but its essential nature stayed: a waypoint, a place of practical refuge, a spot on the map where the world came through and was received with a directness and a warmth that people felt even if they could not have said exactly why. Lillian sat in the evenings on the bench outside the station with her coffee and her books and the prairie going gold in the sunset, and Robert sat beside her. And they were quiet together in the way of two people who have said enough over the years that the silences between them are full rather than empty, layered with everything they have shared and built and survived and chosen. She was 40 years old in 1886, and the frontier was changing around her, the wilderness becoming less wild as the towns grew and the rail lines multiplied, and the land that had been enormous and empty began to fill. And there was loss in that as well as progress, and she held both without pretending either away. She had come west as a starving woman who traded her last horse for a wagon seat, and she had arrived at a place she did not know she was going, and the man at the station had changed everything, not by saving her, because she had not needed saving, but by seeing her, which was the thing she had actually needed and had not known how to ask for. He still saw her. She knew this the way she knew the shape of his handwriting and the sound of his step in the morning, by long and daily evidence that she had never stopped paying attention to. Because paying attention to what was true and real and present was the habit of a woman who had once had nothing and had learned, in the having of nothing, exactly how much the right things were worth. There were grandchildren eventually, Thomas's son first, born in 1891, a solemn-faced boy who looked up at Lillian with Thomas's eyes and Lillian's own directness, which was startling enough to make Robert laugh when he noticed it. They called him James, after Lillian's father, and the name carried in it everything she had traded to get here, all the loss and the distance and the long road, distilled into a person who would grow up in the station's yard and know nothing of starving and everything of being loved. Alina married a quiet, thoughtful man who taught mathematics and who regarded Alina's certainty about things with the steady admiration of someone who has found exactly the right complement to themselves. And they were happy in the particular way of two people who have paid attention to what they actually needed rather than what they were supposed to want. The station's records were meticulous for decades, because Lillian kept them and then Thomas kept them and then Alina helped with the organization, and the accounts were so clear and so complete that anyone could have read them and known exactly what the station had been and what it had cost and what it had earned and what it had given away and what it had become. Which was, Lillian thought, the right way to keep any record. You should be able to tell the whole story from the numbers if you kept them honestly. She kept a different record in her mother's Bible, in the margins and the end pages, in the careful small handwriting she had learned at her father's table. Names and dates and brief notations, the people who had come through in need and been helped on their way. Alice Patton and her daughter, 1876, Colorado Territory. The Birch family, 1878, Nebraska. Others across the years, a running, quiet account of what it meant to have been once exactly where they were and to remember it. Robert found the record once and read it without comment, and then set the Bible back in its place on the shelf, and came to find her in the kitchen where she was doing something ordinary. And he just stood in the doorway looking at her with the expression she knew as the particular one that meant something had moved him more than he had words for at the moment. And she looked back at him and understood, and went on with what she was doing. On the evening of their 20th wedding anniversary, in November of 1892, they sat in the yard under a sky full of Kansas stars, and the night was cold enough for their breath to show, but they were dressed for it, bundled in coats with a blanket across their knees, old enough now to accommodate the cold with preparation rather than endurance. Thomas was inside managing the station. Alina was at her school preparing the week's lessons. The grandchildren were presumably wherever grandchildren went when you were not watching, which in this case was somewhere in the building and reasonably certainly not in danger. 20 years, Robert said. Yes, Lillian said. Do you remember the ledger? He said, the first thing I gave you. I gave it back to you balanced, she said. You gave it back to me better than you found it, he said, which I have thought about many times since. She looked at him in the starlight, this man she had met when she was starving and frightened and too proud to show either, who had offered her the work she needed and asked nothing of her that was not asked of everyone and who had laughed at her joke before he meant to and fallen in love with her practical kindness, just as she had fallen for his. 20 years, she said. Is it what you expected? He said. It was the kind of question only two people with 20 years of honest conversation behind them could ask each other. No, she said. It's better. She paused. It's real. He took her hand under the blanket, the same hand that had shaken his over a ledger in 1872, the same careful, unhurried grip, and she thought that this was what she would have wanted to know. All those years ago on the road west with her empty purse and her thin dress and her one good horse. Not that it would be easy, because it had not always been, but that the trading of what she had for what she was going toward had been the truest thing she had ever done, and that at the end of the trading she would find herself here, in this yard, under these stars, with the whole weight of a life that was unmistakably hers. The prairie wind moved the grass in the darkness beyond the yard, the same endless rolling motion it had always made, the same sound, the same scale, the country going on and on in every direction like a fact too large to argue with. Lillian had argued with it anyway in her way, had come into it with nothing and made something, had planted herself in the middle of its indifference and refused to be moved, and here she still was, rooted and warm and very much alive. 20 more, she said. At the very least, Robert said. The stars burned overhead in their cold and magnificent quantity, and the station was warm behind them, and the night went on, quiet and entire, holding all of it. The loss that had brought her here, the luck of the man at the counter, the love that had grown from an honest handshake and a balanced ledger, and a plate of soup and a laugh that escaped before he could catch it. Holding all of it, the way the prairie held everything, without judgment, simply and enormously, for as long as it lasted, which was longer than either of them would have believed possible on the morning she walked in with her empty hands and said, "I can work," and he said, "I know, let me show you where things are kept." The night settled. The fire inside was warm. The children of their children slept under the station's solid roof. And Lillian Lawson Holloway, who had once been a starving woman with nothing but the will to keep going, leaned her head against her husband's shoulder and listened to the prairie and felt, all the way through to her bones, the particular and irreplaceable peace of a person who has arrived at last exactly where they were always going.